Let's get on to some other people here now. Henry.
Building on Andelman's point, looking back at your perspective, particularly in such detail, looking at history and looking at precedents and prescience, what do you think we've learned since 1990 in sort of powers that be about how we govern the world?
Well, that is interesting, and that's a fascinating question. How do we govern the world? The fact is, we don't govern the world the way they wanted to. We can't govern the world as a few large superpowers designed to, sort of impose our will and our vision on the world. We need to let the world really breathe and to have its own ability, each of the peoples all over the world, to have their own nation and to grow their own nation, to prosper in their own fashion, and to develop in their own fashion. And, people talk a lot about Putin, for instance, nowadays. And Putin is a strong man. He's not a Democrat. He's not a person who believes in freedom for his people and democracy in the Western sense. And he's not. But the fact is that he's the kind of ruler that the Russians have always had. They've had for an eternity, back to the 8th, 9th centuries. He's a strong leader, which is what they want. That works for Russia. It wouldn't work for France or England or America. And what I think we really need to understand is that we need to let countries do their own thing, to become what they need and what they want, and to form a government, a kind of organization that will work for them. And if we do allow that to happen, we do allow people to have self-determination, to form nations within their borders and have within their borders the kind of people that they can live with. I think that's the way the world will be organized in the future much more effectively. And again, forming blocks that were necessary to protect themselves, to have their own security and their economic blocks that will work as trading partners and so on. That's very important. But I think ultimately what we need to do is we need to let the big powers get out of the way and let the smaller powers really begin to flourish and develop. Does that answer your question at all? Yes?
Yeah, I kind of lean on from that. I mean, you talked about learning from the past. I mean, how much do you think is relative from what happened in the past to today? I mean, two very different landscapes, two very different places. Where war in those days, bows and arrows and muskets, and these days war is completely different, ways different. I mean, the second question is a little bit, your view of the world and the way it would break down seems to be very compartmentalised, almost a ghettoisation of the world, and I'm not too sure if that's particularly
the balkanization of the world, right?
Sorry?
The balkanization of the world.
Okay, yeah, possibly.
Well, that's exactly the question. That's exactly the fear that the peacemakers back then had. We don't want to have to deal with, 10 different countries in the Middle East or 7 different countries in the Balkans or what have you. We want to just deal with one country. It's easier that way, more effective that way. The fact is, it's not. It doesn't work that way very well. It didn't work at all back then very well. And it won't work in the future, in my view. I think, again, we have a position, we have the ability now, given global communications, the rapidity of global communications, the ability to understand each other in all different parts of the world. We have the ability now to deal with, on a regular basis, a multiplicity of different kinds of countries and concepts and even languages that wasn't available then. I mean, just as an example, when I first went out as a foreign correspondent to Bangkok and then to Eastern Europe, it took days sometimes to get a telephone call through. We had to book calls well in advance. The embassies, of course, had slightly better communication, but not a lot better. So what was necessary was, in those days, was they had to have a way of dealing with one centralized operation. They didn't have the flexibility to deal with 10 different countries out there, each speaking a different language. They needed to deal with one country, one embassy, one government. And that worked then. That worked in the organization back then, but it certainly doesn't work today. And it shouldn't have worked back then. It should have found a way to deal with all of these different Balkanized regions of the world, if you will, that deserve to have their own independent country. I don't know if I answered both of your questions.
Well, mine was more a case
I'm
of
sorry.
the balkanisation, but then also how much you're talking about learning from the past.
Oh yes, learning from the past.
When really today is a different, totally
there's
different
the old historians have this old song, if you don't learn from the past, you're condemned to repeat it. That's my fear. We really have to understand, if we're going to understand how we get out from where we are now, how we move forward from Iraq or some of these other issues, we have to understand how we got into them in the first place. And I really do believe we're finally getting back to the point before 1919, before the First World War, so that we can begin to redo this, the map of the globe, the global infrastructure, the global kaleidoscope, if you will, in a more rational and more reasonable manner that really works more effectively today. But if we don't understand how we got here in the first place, we'll never be able to figure it all out. Yes? Oh, yes, ma'am. I'm trying to get different people to.
Getting back to your ideas, how do you think the future American government is going to disengage from that region peacefully and successfully? Because I think that's a very big question.
Well, I think we have to get out. I mean, at some point. I mean, again, we can't, look, we can't just suddenly abandon this country. You know, we've come in and, you know, it's like kind of like you walk into a china shop and, you know, you have a piece of crockery, you knock it over and you broke it, you paid for it. Well, we broke it, you know, we have to pay for it now in some fashion. I think it's going to be a long, slow process of evolution rather than suddenly saying, you know, all right, tomorrow we're gone. I mean, the British troops, that was the case. I mean, it's certainly been the case up until now. Last year, the government was saying, well, we'll have, you know, X thousand of troops out by this time this year. It's not so easy. I mean, it's not so easy to suddenly pick up and just abandon everything and leave. I think there will be a move towards the exits. I think that process is beginning already. I think what would work very well initially is an independence of some sort for Kurdistan. I think that can then serve as a model for the rest of the country and how the rest of the country can develop in terms of the ability to split off these countries and make them self-sufficient. But we have to leave behind at least one or two governments that really can work, whether it's a government in Kurdistan, a government in Baghdad, or a government in Basra, or what have you. I think we need to have independent governments in some fashion that can stand on their own feet. Yes, sir?
Do you not think if Kurdistan does become independent, that Turkey...
I'm sorry, I can't...
do you not think that Turkey will just Kurdistan does become independent?
Well, Turkey is a problem. Remember, Turkey is also a member of NATO, and wants to become a member of the European Union. I think we have a lot of leverage in terms of how we deal with Turkey in respect to Kurdistan. And I'm very confident. Look, again, this was another one of these questions of how they drew the boundaries. When they drew the boundaries of Mesopotamia in those days, now Iraq, and Turkey, and so on, they could have drawn them any way they wanted to. They were breaking up the entire Ottoman Empire, which was this vast area. You saw in the book how we had the four leaders of the Western world crawling around on a map on Wilson's floor, dividing where the Baghdad Railway was going to go. What they did was they didn't understand that there were all these Kurds on one side, Kurds on the other side. It needed to probably be relatively in one area. I mean, they couldn't do everything because there were also a bunch of Kurds in Syria and Iran as well. But at least they could have made it a little bit more rational. I think now if there is a homeland, a Kurdish homeland, much as there is in, for instance, Albania, most of the Albanians are in Albania. There are also many in Kosovo. They can go back and forth more freely now that Kosovo is an independent country. The Kurds should be able, in some fashion, to go back and forth. And I think if they had their own nation that they're proud of, that can be a powerful force of good for their own people, that might very well be the effective way of ending, you know, a lot of unrest in the Kurdish part of Turkey.